The safe opened with a soft click, revealing rows of jewelry worth more than Meredith Hayes would earn in 10 whole lifetimes. She stood still for a moment, watching the diamonds capture the morning light filtering through Brandon Ashford's office window. Her hands, calloused from 15 years of cleaning, cooking, and serving that family, trembled slightly as she held the brown envelope she had kept for 3 months. 3 months since she discovered who Victoria Castellano really was. 3 months since the most humiliating Christmas of her existence. The mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, was silent that Tuesday morning in March. Brandon had left for a meeting in Manhattan at 6 a.m., and Victoria, as always, was still asleep in silk sheets that cost more than Meredith's monthly salary. The maid knew every room of that $12 million property better than she knew her own reflection in the mirror. She had polished every marble, wiped every mahogany surface, arranged every imported goose-down pillow. And all this time, she had been invisible. Meredith carefully closed the safe, leaving everything exactly as she had found it. The envelope returned to the pocket of her gray uniform, weighing like lead against her ribs. She descended the main staircase, her sensible shoes making the least sound possible on the Persian carpet. The Christmas tree had been removed months ago, but the memory of that morning still burned like a branding iron. Brandon had called all the staff to the living room that morning of December 25th. Meredith remembered the scent of cinnamon and orange perfuming the air, the golden lights reflecting off the expensive ornaments, the anticipation that made her heart race. 15 years of loyal service. 15 years waking up at 5 a.m., caring for that house as if it were her own family. She had imagined, perhaps, a generous bonus, maybe even a verbal acknowledgement of her dedicated work. What she received was a porcelain piggy bank. $2 jingled inside it when Brandon placed it in her hands with a distracted smile. "For your dreams, Meredith," he had said, already turning to Victoria, who was descending the stairs in a red silk robe, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over her tanned shoulders. Meredith had watched, her hands still holding that ceramic insult, as Brandon guided Victoria to the garage entrance. The rest of the staff had been dismissed, but no one had warned her. She followed them, a forgotten shadow, and watched through the glass door as the cover was removed from a black Rolls-Royce Phantom, with rose gold trim and immaculate white leather interior. $30 million on wheels. Victoria had screamed with joy, throwing her arms around Brandon's neck. Meredith had seen the kiss, long and theatrical, seen his hands slide around her waist, seen the way he looked at that woman as if she were the only person in the universe. And then, when they turned to come back, Victoria had noticed her standing there, holding the $2 piggy bank. The smile Victoria had directed at her contained enough poison to kill. There was no triumph in it, not even conscious cruelty. It was worse. It was indifference. It was the look one gives to a piece of furniture, to an object of no importance that simply exists in space but does not deserve real consideration. In that moment, something inside Meredith Hayes had shattered, not with a dramatic sound, but with a deadly silence, like ice forming over a lake. Now, 3 months later, Meredith was preparing breakfast in the professional kitchen that was rarely used for its original purpose. Brandon preferred that she make simple meals, while Victoria lived on salads delivered by expensive catering services. The maid sliced strawberries with mechanical precision, each movement executed with the perfection of decades of practice. It was then that she heard footsteps descending the stairs. Light, feminine footsteps. Victoria never woke up before 10, unless she had something important. Meredith continued her work, keeping her eyes down when the woman entered the kitchen. Victoria Castellano was objectively beautiful. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that seemed sculpted by an artist obsessed with perfection. Flawless golden skin, green eyes like polished emeralds, a body kept in shape by personal trainers and treatments that cost a fortune. She wore brand-name yoga clothes as if she had just stepped out of a wellness commercial. "Coffee?" Victoria said, not as a request, but as a command. She didn't even look at Meredith while fiddling with her phone. her perfectly manicured nails dancing over the screen. Meredith served the coffee in a fine china cup, adding the oat cream that Victoria preferred. She placed the cup next to the woman and returned to the counter. "Brandon is traveling to Dubai next week," Victoria commented, still not lifting her eyes. "Pack his bags, and that grey suit needs to go to the dry cleaners." "Yes, ma'am." "And Meredith?" Victoria finally looked at her, and there was something sharp in that green gaze. "You've seemed distracted lately. Is everything all right? It would be a shame if we needed to find someone more attentive." Meredith's heart skipped, but her face remained a mask of trained neutrality. "Everything is fine, ma'am. I apologize if I gave that impression." Victoria waved her hand, already losing interest. "Just maintain the standard. Brandon values consistency." After Victoria left, Meredith leaned her hands on the granite sink, breathing slowly. The irony of that phrase echoed in her mind. Brandon values consistency. 15 years of impeccable consistency had earned her a $2 piggy bank, and Victoria, who had known Brandon for only 2 years, had a closet the size of Meredith's apartment, filled with clothes she would never wear twice. But there was something Victoria didn't know. Something Meredith herself had discovered by accident 3 months ago when she entered Victoria's office to clean and found the laptop open. She should have simply closed it and gone on with her work. But something on the screen had caught her attention. A name she recognized. A photograph that had made her freeze. Meredith wasn't technologically savvy, but she knew how to use a cell phone camera. And in the frantic minutes that followed, before hearing footsteps approaching, she had photographed everything she could. Emails, documents, conversations in messaging apps, compromising photographs. A complete map of something that could only be described as a meticulously planned blackmail operation. Victoria Castellano was not who she pretended to be. Her real name was Veronica Castellini, and she had a partner, a man named Marcus Delacroix, who appeared in the photos always wearing sunglasses, with a smile that made Meredith's stomach turn. Together, they had carefully chosen Brandon Ashford, a wealthy widower, lonely, vulnerable after the death of his wife in a car accident 5 years earlier, a man whose real estate empire was worth over $300 million. The evidence was clear. Victoria did not love Brandon. She was preparing him for massive extortion, using intimate information she had collected over 2 years, corporate secrets, minor tax indiscretions, business relationships that would not withstand public scrutiny, and photographs. So many compromising photographs taken in private moments that would destroy Brandon's reputation in the social and business elite of Greenwich. Meredith washed her hands, drying them carefully. The envelope in her pocket felt like it pulsed with possibilities. For 3 months, she had kept it, uncertain about what to do. Part of her wanted to simply hand everything over to Brandon, expose Victoria, and save the man she had respected for years despite everything. But there was another part, a part that had grown since that Christmas morning, that whispered something different. Why save Brandon quickly? Why not let the situation unfold? Let Victoria show her true claws. And then, at the precise moment, intervene. Not as the invisible maid, but as someone who possessed real power. Revenge, Meredith was learning, didn't have to be hot and impulsive. It could be cold, calculated, wrapped in golden paper, and delivered at the exact moment to cause maximum impact. She heard the Rolls-Royce engine rumble in the garage. Victoria leaving for another day of luxury, funded by a man who had no idea he was being systematically destroyed by the woman he thought he loved. Meredith smiled for the first time in months. A small smile, almost imperceptible, but real. And she returned to her work, polishing the silver, as she had always done, invisible, underestimated, and for the first time in 15 years, absolutely dangerous. The black limousine glided up the circular driveway of Ashford Manor precisely at 7 p.m., punctual as always. Meredith watched from the pantry window, recognizing the driver Brandon used for important corporate events. That night would be the annual Ashford Foundation charity dinner, held at the Hartford Grand Hotel, an event that attracted Connecticut's elite and represented the impeccable public face of Brandon's empire. Victoria had descended the stairs 15 minutes earlier, an apparition in a blood-red Valentino dress that hugged every curve of her body like a second skin. Diamonds, real, not costume, sparkled at her neck and ears, reflecting the light from the crystal chandeliers. Her hair was pinned in an elegant bun that exposed the perfect line of her jaw. She looked exactly like what Brandon believed she was, a sophisticated partner, suitable to stand beside a real estate magnate. Meredith had helped dress that woman, zipping up the delicate zipper, adjusting the necklace, keeping her eyes down while Victoria inspected every detail in the full-length mirror of the room. Throughout the process, Victoria had spoken on the phone with someone named M, her voice low and conspiratorial, occasionally letting out laughs that sounded too artificial, too calculated. "He suspects nothing," Victoria had murmured on the phone while Meredith pretended to adjust the hem of the dress. "The trip to Dubai will be perfect. 3 weeks is enough time for us to transfer what we need." Meredith's heart had raced, but her hands remained steady, her expression neutral. Invisibility had its advantages. People spoke freely near those they considered irrelevant. Now, watching the limousine disappear down the tree-lined avenue, Meredith finally allowed her shoulders to relax. The mansion was empty except for her and Raymond, the 60-year-old groundskeeper who lived in the guest house at the back of the property. She had at least 5 hours before Brandon and Victoria returned. 5 hours to do what needed to be done. Meredith ascended the service staircase, her steps silent on the thick carpet. The second-floor corridor was lit only by the automatic nightlight, casting elongated shadows that danced on the French wallpapered walls. She passed the master bedroom, Brandon's private library, the gym that Victoria used with her personal trainer 3 times a week. Victoria's office was at the end of the hall, a room that had once served as the painting studio of Brandon's late wife, Margaret. Meredith remembered Margaret, a kind woman with an easy smile who always asked about her family, who doubled the Christmas bonus without Brandon knowing. Her death in a car accident on Interstate 95 had devastated not only Brandon, but the entire staff that worked in the mansion. Victoria had transformed that space into something entirely different. The canvases and brushes had been replaced by minimalist decor in shades of gray and white, with a glass desk strategically positioned facing the window that overlooked the gardens. It was a space that looked like it had come straight out of a design magazine, cold and impersonal. Meredith tested the doorknob, locked as she expected. But 15 years of cleaning that house meant she knew every lock, every spare key, every shortcut and architectural secret. Her hands found the master keyring she kept in her uniform, and after 3 attempts, the door opened with a soft click. The office smelled of Victoria's perfume, something French and too expensive. Meredith closed the door behind her and turned on only the small desk lamp, keeping the curtains drawn. She couldn't risk Raymond noticing light coming from that window. Victoria's laptop was on the desk, closed. Meredith knew it was password protected, something she had no skill to hack. But it wasn't the laptop she was looking for this time. It was something more specific, something she had seen in one of the emails she photographed months ago, a mention of physical documents kept securely. Her eyes scanned the room. The bookshelf contained bestsellers that looked as if they had never been opened, volumes of decorative design chosen by the color of their spines. The desk drawers held office supplies organized with obsessive precision. The built-in cabinet housed designer bags on illuminated shelves like works of art. Meredith checked the clock. 8:15. She had time, but she couldn't be careless. That was when she noticed it. A small discrepancy in the baseboard near the window. A section that didn't align perfectly with the rest. She knelt down, running her fingers over the wood, and felt a slight depression. She pressed, and a 20-centimeter panel opened, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a portable safe, the kind that required a numerical combination. Meredith pulled it out carefully, its surprisingly substantial weight. For a moment, she simply held it, considering her options. She didn't have the combination. Forcing it would leave obvious evidence. But then she remembered. One of the emails she had photographed mentioned a date. Remember the combination. The day that changed everything. At the time, it had seemed vague enough to be useless. But now, holding that box, Meredith thought of the conversations she had overheard, the phone calls when Victoria thought she was alone. There was a date Victoria mentioned frequently. February 14th. Not Valentine's Day itself, but the day she met Brandon 2 years ago, at a charity gala in Manhattan. Victoria romanticized that meeting every time she was near Brandon, talking about destiny and instant connection. Meredith typed 021422, February 2nd, 2022, in the European format Victoria often used. Nothing. She tried the American version, 140222. The box remained locked. Then she tried just the day, 1402. A soft click. The lid opened. Inside, organized in clear plastic folders, were documents that made Meredith's stomach tighten. Copies of fake birth certificates, passports with Victoria's face but different names, Veronica Castellini, Victoria Manning, Vivian Cross, bank statements from accounts in the Cayman Islands, and photographs, dozens of them. Brandon in compromising situations. Brandon with other businessmen in a club that clearly wasn't appropriate for someone of his public standing. Brandon signing documents that, Meredith suspected, were forged versions of real contracts. Each photograph dated, catalogued, organized like evidence in a trial. And then, at the bottom of the box, Meredith found something that made her blood run cold. A contract, signed by Victoria Castellano and Marcus Delacroix, detailing the division of assets they planned to extort from Brandon. The target amount, $50 million. The execution date, 3 weeks from now, while Brandon was in Dubai and vulnerable, far from his usual lawyers and advisors. But there was more. A list of previous targets, 3 names, 3 men. Next to each name, an amount. 22 million, 15 million, 38 million. And a final note, terrifying in its simplicity. Successfully liquidated. Meredith took her phone with trembling hands and began to photograph everything. Every page, every document, every compromising image. The flash was off, but the screen illuminated her face as she worked, revealing an expression of determination she rarely showed. A sound made her freeze. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, masculine. Not Raymond. He never entered the main house uninvited. Her heart raced as she quickly replaced the documents in the box, closed it, and slid it back into the hidden compartment. The doorknob turned. Meredith turned off the lamp and pressed herself against the wall behind the open door as it slowly swung open. The hallway light created a golden rectangle on the carpet. A male silhouette appeared, partially blocking the light. "I knew it," a voice said. It wasn't Brandon. It was younger, with a slightly European accent. Marcus Delacroix. I knew someone was snooping around. He entered the office, and Meredith held her breath. The man was tall, probably in his 30s, wearing a dark suit that looked military in its precise cut. He turned on the ceiling light, flooding the room with relentless clarity. Meredith remained completely still, hidden by the angle of the open door. Her phone was in her uniform pocket, still unlocked. If he made the slightest sound, she would be discovered. Marcus walked to the desk, his back to Meredith. He opened Victoria's laptop with familiarity, typing quickly. His posture was tense, alert. After a few minutes, he murmured something in a language Meredith didn't recognize, Italian perhaps, and closed the computer. Then he did something unexpected. He pulled out his phone and called someone. "We have a problem," he said in English, his voice low. "Someone has been in the office. I can feel it. Things have been moved." A pause as he listened to the response. "No, Victoria is with the target at dinner. It must be the maid or the groundskeeper. Perhaps it's time to accelerate the schedule. We can't risk exposure now, not when we're so close." Another pause, longer this time. Understood. I'll take care of it. If there are inconvenient witnesses, they will be managed. He hung up and stood still for a moment that felt like an eternity. Then, abruptly, he left the office, closing the door behind him. The footsteps faded down the main staircase. Meredith waited a full 5 minutes before moving, her heart pounding so hard she feared the sound could be heard through the walls. When she finally allowed herself to breathe normally, her legs nearly gave way beneath her. Managed. The word echoed in her mind with deadly implications. This was not just blackmail. It was something much more dangerous. Meredith descended the service staircase with weak legs, each step requiring concentration to avoid tripping. Her hands still trembled when she reached the ground floor, and she had to lean against the oak railing for a moment, breathing deeply to regain her composure. The word managed continued to echo in her mind like a funeral bell, carrying implications she preferred not to contemplate fully. The kitchen was silent and empty when she entered. The Viking stove's digital clock read 8:47. Under normal circumstances, she would be preparing desserts for Brandon and Victoria's return, or organizing the pantry, or executing any of the dozens of tasks that filled her evenings. But this was not a normal night. Nothing would be normal again. She pulled out her phone with still unsteady hands and opened the photo gallery. There they were, hundreds of images documenting Victoria's systematic betrayal, the evidence of crimes that went far beyond simple blackmail. The list of previous targets haunted her thoughts. 3 men, 3 drained fortunes, and that terrible word, liquidated. What did it mean exactly? She didn't want to imagine, but her mind conjured dark possibilities anyway. Wealthy, isolated, vulnerable men, fortunes transferred. And then what? Convenient disappearances? Unexplained accidents? Margaret Ashford had died in a car accident 5 years ago, before Victoria entered Brandon's life. But what if there was a pattern no one had noticed? Meredith shook her head, trying to focus. Paranoia wouldn't help. She needed to think clearly, act strategically. Marcus was another issue. His presence on the property, his suspicion, his implied threat to manage inconvenient witnesses, all represented immediate danger. She needed to act fast. Meredith climbed to her room on the 3rd floor, a simple but comfortable space that she kept impeccably organized. From a secret drawer in her dresser, she pulled out a new thumb drive she had purchased weeks earlier, anticipating that she might need it. She connected it to the old laptop she used to manage shopping lists and transferred all the photos she had taken from Victoria's office. Then, with firmer hands now that she had a plan, she wrote a letter. Not on the computer, where digital files could be traced or hacked, but by hand, on physical paper. The letter detailed everything she had discovered about Victoria Castellano, or Veronica Castellini, and Marcus Delacroix. It described the location of the documents in the office, the existence of the hidden safe, and its combination. And it explained her suspicions about the previous targets, and what liquidated could mean. She addressed the letter to Leonard Richardson, Brandon's lawyer, whom she knew by sight from occasional visits to the mansion. Richardson seemed honest, competent, and more importantly, had no loyalty to Victoria. The letter included explicit instructions. It should only be opened if something happened to Meredith, or if she failed to make contact within specific intervals. At 11 p.m., when she was sure everyone was in their rooms, Meredith quietly left the mansion through the back entrance. The Greenwich property was vast enough that she could walk to the secondary gate without being seen by the main cameras. She knew every blind spot after 15 years. The city at night had a different quality. Silent streets lined with valuable properties, each hiding its own secrets behind high walls and electronic gates. She walked 3 blocks until she found a public mailbox, where she deposited the registered letter for Richardson. The cold March air cut through her thin coat, but she barely felt it. She was too focused on the task, on the weight of the decisions she had made, on the consequences that were still to come. Victoria and Marcus had underestimated the invisible maid, treating her like unimportant furniture. That mistake would cost them dearly. When she returned to the mansion, she found all the lights off except for Brandon's room. She quietly ascended to her own room and lay down fully dressed on the bed, her phone secure in her hands. The thumb drive was hidden in a place that even a thorough search of the house would not easily reveal. Tomorrow, she would begin the next phase. No longer just collecting evidence, but actively manipulating the situation. Brandon was already questioning Victoria. Now she needed to deepen those doubts, create fissures that would grow until the whole facade crumbled. Revenge, Meredith discovered, was not a dish served cold. It was a multi-course meal, each dish meticulously prepared, seasoned with patience, and served at the exact moment it would have the maximum impact, and she was just beginning to serve the appetizers. Morning arrived with a dense fog that enveloped the Ashford estate like a gray shroud. Meredith woke up before the alarm, as always, but this time it wasn't out of trained habit. Her sleep had been fragmented, punctuated by restless dreams where she ran through endless hallways while heavy footsteps echoed behind her. At 5:15, she gave up trying to sleep and got up, preparing for the day with the same meticulousness as always, although each movement carried a new weight. The grey uniform was impeccable, as required, hair pinned up in a discreet bun, silent shoes on the Persian carpets. But as she descended the service stairs to begin her morning routine, Meredith realized she was no longer the same person who mechanically performed these tasks 15 years ago. Something fundamental had changed when she decided not only to expose Victoria, but to carefully orchestrate her downfall. The kitchen was cold when she entered, the kind of cold that seeps into the bones on March mornings in Connecticut. She turned on the Italian coffee maker that Brandon preferred, placing freshly ground Colombian beans in the filter with the precision of a sacred ritual. As the water boiled, her thoughts returned to the conversation from the previous night with Brandon, to the unexpected vulnerability he had shown. Throughout all those years, she had seen him as a distant employer, competent but emotionally inaccessible. Margaret had been the soul of that house, the bridge between the privileged world they inhabited and the basic humanity that kept it connected. After she died, Brandon had gradually shut down, transforming into a stiffer version of himself. Victoria had not softened that hardness. She merely exploited it. The coffee began to bubble, filling the kitchen with its rich aroma. Meredith was cutting fresh fruit for breakfast when she heard the sound of tires on the gravel of the circular driveway. Her entire body tensed. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. Who would arrive so early? She moved to the pantry window, keeping to the shadows, and saw the $30 million Rolls-Royce parking. Victoria emerged from the vehicle wearing the same red dress from the night before, but now wrinkled, her makeup smudged. She stumbled slightly as she climbed the steps to the main entrance, and Meredith noticed she was barefoot, carrying her high-heeled shoes in one hand. The front door opened and closed. Irregular footsteps in the marble hall, then silence as Victoria presumably ascended to her room. Meredith returned to the counter, processing that scene. Victoria had spent the night out, returning now in a state that suggested excess alcohol or something worse. And Brandon was home, likely awake, certainly aware of the hour at which his mistress was returning. 10 minutes later, Brandon descended the main stairs. Meredith heard him before she saw him, the heavy footsteps of someone who hadn't slept. When he entered the kitchen, his face was pale, jaw tense. He wore workout clothes, as if he had planned to run but had given up. "Good morning, sir," Meredith said softly, pouring coffee into his favorite mug, a simple piece of pottery that Margaret had made in a pottery class years ago. "The coffee is ready." Brandon accepted the mug without making eye contact, his hands wrapping around the porcelain as if seeking warmth. He took a long sip before speaking. "She just arrived." It wasn't a question, but Meredith answered anyway. "Yes, sir, a few minutes ago. Wearing yesterday's dress." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, which somehow made the statement more painful. "You saw me as a fool, didn't you, all this time?" Meredith chose her words with the care of someone disarming a bomb. "It's not my place to judge, sir. But if I may say, people who manipulate are experts at deception. There's no shame in having trusted." Margaret used to say something similar. He finally looked at her, and there was something devastated in those eyes. "She said I was too good at building empires, but terrible at reading people. Victoria seemed so different at first. Kind, interested in who I was, not just in what I had." "Skilled manipulators always start that way," Meredith said. "It's when the guard is down that they establish control." Brandon studied her for a long moment. "How do you know so much about this?" The question caught her off guard. Meredith hesitated, considering how much to reveal. "My sister," she finally said, allowing truth to color the lie. "She got involved with someone who seemed perfect. In the end, he drained all her savings and disappeared. She never fully recovered." It wasn't entirely false. Her sister had indeed been deceived years ago, although the details were different. But the essence was real, and Brandon responded to that authenticity. "I'm sorry," he said, and it sounded genuine. "Is that why you're here alone? No close family?" "My sister is in a nursing home in Hartford. I visit when I can." Meredith turned her attention back to the fruit, creating emotional distance before the conversation deepened too much. "Would you like me to prepare eggs Benedict, sir? Or perhaps an omelette?" Brandon shook his head. "I have no appetite." He took another sip of coffee, then said abruptly, "I'm going to hire that investigator. What you suggested yesterday. I need to know the truth, no matter how much it hurts." "It's a wise decision, sir." "Do you know anyone? Someone discreet?" Meredith thought quickly. She didn't know private investigators personally, but she had seen business cards in Brandon's office over the years of cleaning. "Mr. Richardson mentioned someone once, I believe. During a meeting I overheard accidentally. A professional he used to check backgrounds on a corporate merger." "Richardson." Brandon nodded. "I'll call him today." He finished the coffee and set the mug on the counter, moving to leave, then stopped. "Meredith, thank you. For being here. For being constant." After he left, Meredith allowed herself a moment to absorb that interaction. Brandon was waking up, questioning, seeking truth. She had planted the right seeds, gently pushing him in the necessary direction without revealing her own role. Now she needed to ensure that when the complete truth emerged, the blame fell entirely on Victoria and Marcus. The day progressed with superficial normalcy. Victoria finally emerged from her room at 11, looking recovered thanks to considerable makeup skills. She wore expensive workout clothes and acted as if nothing was wrong, preparing a green smoothie in the blender she never used and making phone calls in hushed tones as she walked through the halls. Meredith watched her discreetly while dusting the living room furniture. Victoria was agitated. Her movements had a nervous quality. She checked her phone constantly, typed quick messages, looked out the window as if waiting for someone. At 2 in the afternoon, an unfamiliar car entered the driveway. A plain black sedan, the kind that didn't attract attention. Marcus Delacroix emerged from the vehicle, and this time Meredith saw him clearly in the daylight. Tall, probably 6 feet tall, with dark hair slicked back, expensive sunglasses hiding his eyes. He moved with the confidence of someone who had the right to be there, climbing the steps to the main entrance without hesitation. Victoria met him at the door, and even from a distance. Meredith could see the tension in the encounter. They didn't touch, didn't embrace. It was strictly professional, or perhaps something more calculated. They entered together, heading straight for Victoria's office on the 2nd floor. Meredith continued her tasks, polishing silver in the dining room but keeping her ears attentive. The peculiar acoustics of the mansion meant that raised voices from the 2nd floor occasionally echoed through the stairwell. She couldn't discern words, but the tone was clear. Argument, disagreement, and then, abruptly, silence. 20 minutes later, Marcus descended alone. He paused in the entry hall, looking around as if cataloging every detail of the property. His eyes passed over Meredith, who was arranging flowers in a crystal vase but didn't linger. She was invisible again, just part of the decor. But then he did something unexpected. He approached her, stopping a few feet away. "You're the maid," he said. It wasn't a question. Meredith kept her eyes down, her hands continuing to adjust the flowers. "Yes, sir." "How long have you worked here?" 15 years, sir." "A long time. You must know this house very well, all its secrets." There was something sharp in that comment, a veiled threat. "I know how to clean and maintain, sir. Secrets aren't my area." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Smart. Victoria said you were invisible, but invisible can be dangerous sometimes. You see things you shouldn't." Meredith finally looked at him, allowing genuine confusion to color her expression. "I don't understand, sir. I simply do my job." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded as if he had reached a conclusion. "Of course. Keep it that way." He turned to leave, then added without looking back, "And Meredith? Sometimes curiosity is dangerous, especially in houses like this." After he left, Meredith needed to sit down, her legs suddenly weak. This was not paranoia. Marcus was warning her directly, making it clear that he suspected something. She had been careful, but perhaps not careful enough. He felt that someone was watching, probing, and she was the obvious candidate. The danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate and personal. And Meredith realized with crystalline clarity that she had crossed a point of no return. She could no longer simply hand over the evidence and walk away. Marcus and Victoria already saw her as a potential threat. If she backed down now, she might not have the opportunity to protect herself later. She needed to accelerate the timeline. Make Brandon discover the truth before Marcus decided to manage the inconvenient witness. The revenge she had planned as a cold dish needed to be served quickly before she herself became a victim. The atmosphere in the Ashford mansion became charged in the following days, as if an invisible storm was forming in the silent hallways. Meredith Hayes felt this change in every fiber of her being, a tension that transformed routine tasks into calculated performances where every movement needed to be perfect, every expression carefully neutral. Brandon had retreated to his office, emerging only for meals that he barely touched. He spent hours on the phone, his voice low but intense, leaking through the heavy oak doors. Meredith knew, from the fragments of conversations she caught while passing through the hallway, that he had contacted Leonard Richardson and through him found a private investigator. The gears were in motion, but she feared not fast enough. Victoria, for her part, had become an even more volatile presence. She roamed the house like a caged animal, her green eyes constantly checking her phone conversations becoming more frequent and increasingly whispered. Meredith watched her with the trained peripheral vision of someone who had learned to be invisible, noticing how Victoria's hands trembled slightly when she typed messages, how her smiles at Brandon seemed more forced each day. And then there was Marcus. He had begun to appear more frequently, always with elaborate excuses about business matters he needed to discuss with Victoria. Brandon accepted these explanations with cold politeness, but Meredith saw the distrust growing in his eyes. With each visit from Marcus, the mask of normalcy grew thinner, more transparent. It was on a Thursday afternoon, as the March light filtered through the windows creating golden patterns on the marble floor, that everything began to truly unravel. Meredith was in the second-floor hallway, polishing the antique mirrors that Margaret had collected during trips to Europe. She could see the reflection of Victoria's office in the polished surface of the glass, and that was how she noticed when the door swung open abruptly. Victoria stormed out, her normally composed face now contorted into something close to panic. Marcus was right behind her, gripping her arm tightly enough to leave marks. Meredith pressed herself against the wall, becoming part of the decor, but her ears caught every word of the heated discussion. "You promised he wouldn't suspect until Dubai," Victoria hissed, trying to break free. But he hired an investigator, Marcus. A real investigator. Keep your voice down, you idiot. Marcus pulled her back into the office, but not before his eyes swept the hallway. They passed over Meredith without stopping, but she felt the weight of that glance nonetheless. The door clicked shut behind them. Meredith wasted no time. She hurried down the service stairs, her heart pounding against her ribs like a hammer. She needed to warn Brandon. But how to do that without revealing that she had been eavesdropping? How to protect him without exposing her own surveillance? She found him in the library, surrounded by financial documents spread out on the mahogany table that had once belonged to his father. Brandon looked up when she entered, and for the first time in 15 years, Meredith saw genuine fear in that normally controlled face. "Meredith." His voice was hoarse. "Close the door, please." She obeyed, remaining near the entrance, her hands crossed in front of her gray uniform. Brandon ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had only seen a few times. "The investigator Richardson recommended found something," he said abruptly. "Victoria isn't who she says she is. Her real name is Veronica Castellini. She has a partner, a man named Marcus Delacroix." He laughed bitterly. "The same Marcus who has been visiting my house, drinking my whiskey, and pretending to be a business consultant." Meredith remained silent, allowing him to continue. "And they've done this before. 3 times. Men like me, wealthy widowers, vulnerable. And then..." His voice faltered. "The 3 men are dead now. Convenient accidents after massive financial transfers." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Meredith felt the moment when Brandon connected all the dots, when the full realization of the danger he was in dawned in his eyes. "Margaret," he whispered, "5 years ago, the accident on the highway." He looked at Meredith, and there was horror in that gaze. She shouldn't have been on that road. She was going to Hartford to visit a friend. But witnesses said another car forced her off the road. They never found the driver. Meredith felt her own stomach tighten. She remembered that night, the police at the door, Brandon crumbling in a way she had never imagined possible. Margaret Ashford had been a vibrant 51-year-old woman, full of plans and life. And if her death hadn't been an accident, but the first move in a long game. "I need to get out of this house," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need to get somewhere safe while the authorities deal with this." "Sir," she said carefully, "if they suspect you found out, you'll be in danger. You need to leave this house, go somewhere safe until the authorities handle it." Brandon shook his head slowly. "The investigator has already contacted the FBI. There's an agent on the way." He checked his wristwatch, the one Margaret had given him on their last birthday together. "They should be here in an hour, but..." He hesitated. "Victoria and Marcus can't know I'm aware. If they flee now, they may never be caught. The FBI wants to catch them in the act." "So you're using yourself as bait?" It wasn't a question. Meredith knew Brandon well enough to recognize that stubborn determination. "I won't let them escape. Not after what they did." His jaw was tense, especially if Margaret... A sound made them freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, light, feminine. Victoria was approaching the library. Brandon composed himself quickly, gathering the documents and placing them in a drawer. Meredith was already moving toward the door when he called her softly. "Meredith, if something goes wrong, there's an envelope in the safe in my suite. The combination is Margaret's birthday. Inside are instructions and provisions for you and the rest of the staff." He paused, and an apology for having been so blind. Before she could respond, the door opened. Victoria entered, her smile perfectly calibrated but not reaching her eyes. She wore a flowing white dress that made her look angelic, a cruel irony. "Darling, you've been locked in here for hours," she said with false concern. "I thought we could go out for dinner tonight. That French restaurant you like?" Brandon stood, his own mask sliding into place. "Of course. Let me just finish a few emails." Victoria approached, placing a hand on his arm. Meredith saw Brandon suppress a shiver. "You've seemed so stressed lately. Is everything okay with the business?" "Just the usual. Nothing you need to worry about." Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were trying to decipher whether he was being genuine. Then she turned to Meredith, who was still near the door like a shadow. "I don't need you anymore today. You can have the night off." It was strange. Victoria never dismissed the staff early, especially not with that false generosity. Meredith felt alarm course through her spine, but merely nodded respectfully and left. In the hallway, she pressed herself against the wall near the library, pretending to adjust a picture while listening. Victoria's voice, low and intense now that she thought she was alone with Brandon. "Marcus needs some documents signed tonight. He'll be here at 8. A pause. "I hope you don't mind signing without reading thoroughly. Just formalities for investment transfers." Transfers. The word sent ice through Meredith's veins. They were accelerating the timeline, trying to drain Brandon's assets before he could react. She needed to warn the FBI, ensure they arrived before 8. Meredith moved quickly through the corridors, ascending to her room on the 3rd floor. Her phone was hidden under the mattress, the pen drive with all the photographed evidence in a secret compartment in her suitcase. She dialed the number Richardson had secretly given her days ago when Brandon had asked the lawyer to include her in communications as a potential witness. "Richardson." "Sir, it's Meredith Hayes. They're trying to get Brandon to sign documents tonight at 8. I think they're going to accelerate everything." Silence on the other end. Then the lawyer's voice tense. "The agents are on their way. You need to get out of that house, Meredith. If they suspect you know anything. I can't leave Brandon alone with them until then. You're not law enforcement. It's not your responsibility." 15 years, she interrupted softly. 15 years in this house. He is my responsibility." She hung up before Richardson could argue further. She checked the clock. 7:15. 45 minutes until the agents arrived. 1 hour and 45 until Marcus showed up with his fraudulent documents. Meredith descended the service stairs, moving through the house with the familiarity of decades. She knew where each board creaked, which corridors offered better acoustics, which security cameras had blind spots. Invisibility had its advantages. She found Brandon still in the library, now on the phone with someone, his voice carefully neutral. Victoria had left, likely to prepare for the false dinner that would never happen. Meredith knocked lightly on the door before entering. Brandon covered the microphone of the phone. "I thought I told you to go home." "With all due respect, sir, I'm not going anywhere." She kept her voice low but firm. "The agents will arrive in 40 minutes. Until then, someone needs to watch your back." Something passed over his face, perhaps surprise or gratitude. He nodded once before returning to the call. Meredith positioned herself by the window, watching the main entrance and any vehicle that approached. Time dragged like molasses. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound amplified in her alert consciousness. She saw Victoria pass through the hall toward her room, noted the lights turning on the 2nd floor as the woman prepared. At 7:28, a plain black sedan entered the driveway. Not the expected FBI vehicles, but Marcus's car. He was early, and he wasn't alone. Meredith saw another figure in the passenger seat, a large man in dark clothing. "Sir," she said urgently, "Marcus is here, and he brought someone." Brandon stood, his face paling. "The agents, not here yet." Meredith was already moving, locking the library door from the inside. "We have to buy time." It was then they heard it, the sound of the front door being opened, not with a key, but with force. Glass shattering. Male voices, low and urgent, and Victoria's voice, louder now, directing them. "To the office. He's in the office." The hunt had begun, and Meredith realized with crystalline clarity that they were about to discover whether 15 years of invisibility could transform into survival when finally noticed. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the tranquil Ashford estate like a gunshot. shattering the illusion of security that the city's elite cherished. Meredith threw herself to the floor instinctively, pulling Brandon down with her. They flattened against the cold linoleum of Raymond's kitchen as the gunfire continued outside, each shot making her flinch. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When it finally fell silent, the stillness that followed was somehow more deafening than the gunfire. Meredith forced herself to stand, trembling, and cautiously looked out the window. Marcus's accomplice lay sprawled on the gravel of the driveway, agents surrounding him. Marcus was on his knees, hands behind his head, the expression of defeat twisting his once arrogant features, and Victoria was being handcuffed by a female agent, her mouth moving in silent protests that no one could hear. "It's over," Brandon said softly, more to himself than to Meredith. He leaned against the kitchen counter, suddenly looking exhausted. "It's finally over." But Meredith knew it wasn't quite that simple. The immediate danger had passed, but the consequences were just beginning. Investigations, interrogations, public revelations that would tarnish the Ashford name, even if Brandon was a victim. And the persistent question about Margaret, about whether her death 5 years ago had been the true beginning of this tragedy. In the days that followed, Ashford Manor transformed into a crime scene. FBI investigators combed through every room, cataloging evidence, photographing documents, reconstructing the web of lies that Victoria and Marcus had woven so carefully. Victoria's office proved particularly fruitful, yielding not only the documents Meredith had photographed, but additional laptops and disposable phones that revealed the full extent of their operations. The 3 previous targets were confirmed. Wealthy widowers, all dead under circumstances that seemed accidental, but would now be reinvestigated as possible homicides. And Margaret Ashford, whose accident 5 years ago now took on a new, sinister light. Investigators found phone records between Victoria and Marcus dating back months before Margaret's death, suggesting long-term planning that made one's stomach churn. Meredith gave her testimony multiple times, sitting in sterile FBI rooms recounting every detail she had observed, every conversation she had overheard, every photograph she had taken. The agents called her a heroine, saying that her evidence had been crucial in building the case. But she didn't feel heroic. She felt tired, haunted by questions about what she could have done differently, whether she could have saved Margaret if she had noticed the pattern sooner. Brandon was dealing with the betrayal in ways that alternated between controlled anger and contemplative silence. He spent days locked in his office, consulting lawyers, talking with investigators, trying to untangle his finances from the poison that Victoria had injected into them. But at night, Meredith saw him wandering the halls like a ghost, touching objects that belonged to Margaret, standing before photographs of her, processing the horror that her death could have been orchestrated by people who would later infiltrate his life with malicious intent. It was on one of those nights, a week after the arrests, that he sought out Meredith. She was in the kitchen making tea, unable to sleep, when he came down wearing a robe over pajamas, looking like a diminished version of the imposing magnate he used to be. "I can't stop thinking," he said without preamble, sitting on the island stool where they had talked before. If they killed her to make me vulnerable, then everything that came after, everything I felt for Victoria, was built on the grave of the only woman I ever truly loved. Meredith poured tea for both of them, choosing her words carefully. You can't blame yourself for being deceived by professionals who perfected their art on previous victims. And Margaret wouldn't want you to be consumed by guilt. You only met her a few weeks before she died. How can you be sure? Because in the 3 weeks I spent under the same roof as Mrs. Margaret, she spoke of nothing else but how much she loved you, her plans for a future together, how lucky she felt. Meredith took a sip of tea, letting the warmth soothe her tight throat. She wouldn't want that love to be stained by anger or guilt. She would want you to live, truly live. Brandon didn't respond immediately, but something in his posture softened slightly. They sat in comfortable silence for long minutes, united by shared trauma and a growing understanding that survival required forgiving not only others, but themselves. "There's something I need to tell you," Brandon finally spoke. "Or rather, something I need to give you." He pulled an envelope from the pocket of his robe, placing it on the counter between them. "This belongs to you. I should have given it to you long ago." Meredith looked at the envelope without touching it. "Sir, 15 years of loyal service deserves more than a $2 piggy bank." His voice carried genuine shame. "Inside is a check, an amount I hope compensates for the insult of that Christmas, and documents establishing a pension fund that will take care of you and your sister comfortably." "Sir, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Brandon gently interrupted her. "You saved my life, Meredith. Not just physically, but you gave me back the truth about Margaret, freed me from living a lie that would have eventually destroyed me. This is the least I can do." Meredith took the envelope with trembling hands, feeling the weight not of the paper, but of the recognition, of the respect she had longed for 15 years. Tears she hadn't allowed during the entire ordeal finally threatened to spill over. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "No," he replied. "Thank you." 6 months later, Ashford Manor breathed again. Not with the artificial opulence that Victoria had imposed, but with something more genuine, more human. The windows remained open even when the air conditioning was on, allowing the smell of freshly cut grass and roses from the garden to fill the hallways. Photographs of Margaret had returned to the walls, not as shrines of mourning, but as celebrations of a life well lived. Meredith Hayes was in the kitchen that September morning, but no longer wearing the gray uniform that had been her second skin for 15 years. She wore comfortable pants and a blue linen blouse, her hair loose over her shoulders instead of the severe bun she had always kept. She was still making coffee for Brandon, but now it was her choice, not an obligation. Everything had changed, and simultaneously, it remained comfortingly familiar. The trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier. Victoria Castellano, or Veronica Castellini as the courts called her, had been sentenced to 25 years for conspiracy, fraud, extortion, and 3 counts of first-degree murder. Marcus Delacroix received life without the possibility of parole. The evidence Meredith had collected, combined with the FBI's forensic investigation, had built a case that even the most expensive lawyers could not dismantle. Margaret's death was confirmed as orchestrated homicide. Victoria and Marcus had watched her for months, studying her patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The driver who forced her off the road that night 5 years ago was identified as a hired criminal who had since died under unrelated circumstances. But phone records and bank transfers traced a clear line of responsibility back to the architects of that horror. For Brandon, that confirmation brought closure mixed with renewed pain. He spent weeks after the verdict in contemplative silence, processing not only Victoria's betrayal, but the renewed loss of Margaret, this time with full knowledge that she had been taken from him deliberately for pure greed. Meredith watched his journey through grief, offering constant presence without judgment, hot tea on sleepless nights, and silence when words would be inadequate. Now, as the coffee dripped into the French press he preferred, Meredith heard his footsteps descending the main staircase. Brandon entered the kitchen looking lighter than he had in months, wearing jeans and a casual sweater, instead of the business suits he had always worn. At 53, he was relearning how to live rather than merely exist. "Good morning," he said, and there was genuine warmth in the greeting. "Are you making that bread Raymond taught us?" "Rosemary focaccia from the gardens." Meredith smiled, pulling the perfectly golden baking tray from the oven. Raymond had returned after the trial, horrified to have missed all the drama, but relieved that everyone had survived. He had taken on the role of head gardener and occasional cooking instructor, sharing his grandmother's Italian recipes with contagious enthusiasm. Brandon poured coffee for both of them. a gesture that would have been unthinkable a year ago when rigid employer-employee barriers defined every interaction. I forgot to mention yesterday. The lawyers finalized the corporate restructuring. The Ashford Foundation will be entirely focused on supporting victims of financial fraud and domestic violence. Margaret would approve, Meredith said softly. I hope so. He added sugar to his coffee, stirring thoughtfully. And what about you? Are you still considering the university's offer? Meredith had received an unexpected invitation 3 months earlier. A criminology professor from Yale, intrigued by the widely publicized case, had contacted her to lecture on observation and evidence collection from a non-traditional perspective. What began as a one-time lecture had evolved into an offer for an adjunct instructor position, teaching workshops on situational awareness and evidence documentation. I'm leaning towards accepting, she admitted, but it would only be part-time. I thought perhaps I could still help here a few days a week if you still need it. Brandon shook his head firmly. Not as an employee, Meredith. Those days are over. But as a friend who is always welcome. Absolutely. He hesitated, then continued. In fact, I was thinking of making some changes to the property. This house is too big for one person. I was considering converting the East Wing into residential space for fraud victims who need a safe place while they restart their lives. The idea was so perfectly fitting that Meredith felt tears threaten. The mansion that had served as the backdrop for manipulation and near tragedy would be transformed into a sanctuary for those who had escaped similar traps. Margaret, with her generous heart and keen sense of justice, would have loved it. It's perfect, she said. They shared breakfast in companionable silence, the kind of comfortable quiet that only comes from having traversed hell together and emerged whole on the other side. The September sun poured golden light through the windows, illuminating the space where so much terror had unfolded months ago, but now offered only peace. Later that morning, Raymond arrived with his 8-year-old grandson, Tommy, who was visiting during a school break. The boy ran through the gardens with boundless energy, his laughter echoing across the perfectly manicured lawns. Meredith watched him from the living room window, remembering the $2 piggy bank she had received that devastating Christmas. The irony was not lost on her, how such an insignificant gift had triggered a chain of events that exposed villainy and ultimately saved lives. That piggy bank still existed. Meredith kept it on her dresser, along with the check Brandon had given her. She would never open it, never touch the $2 inside. It was a reminder, a symbol of how invisible she had been and how visibly important she had become when it truly mattered. Brandon joined her at the window, watching Tommy chase butterflies through the rose beds. You know what else Margaret would say? What? That humiliation doesn't define worth. That revenge shouldn't be about destruction, but about restoration. He looked at Meredith with an expression that mixed respect and something deeper, true friendship tempered in the fire of shared adversity. You could have exposed Victoria immediately when you discovered everything, but you waited, collected the proper evidence, ensured that when the truth came to light, it would be irrefutable. It wasn't impulsive revenge. It was meticulous justice. Meredith considered his words. For months of planning, she had wondered if her motivations were pure or if part of her simply wanted to see Victoria suffer as she had suffered. The answer, she realized now, was complex. It had been both justice and revenge, intertwined so tightly that separating one from the other would be impossible. But the end result had saved Brandon, honored Margaret's memory, and ensured that Victoria and Marcus would not create more victims. Margaret would also say not to dwell in the past, Meredith finally replied. To learn, to grow, but not to let trauma define our entire future. Wise advice. Brandon smiled, and it was a genuine expression that reached his eyes for the first time in as long as Meredith could remember. So, let's practice what we preach. How about helping to plan the launch event for the residency program? We'll need someone who truly understands what these people will be going through. I'd love to. The day continued with a gentle rhythm that Meredith was learning to appreciate. No frantic rush to maintain appearances. No tension of avoiding Victoria's wrath. Just the natural movement of life being lived authentically. She spent the afternoon reviewing resumes for staff positions in the new residency program, marking candidates who demonstrated not only competence, but real empathy. As evening fell, she found herself back in the kitchen, this time preparing a simple pasta dish with sauce that Raymond had taught her. Brandon came down when he smelled the aroma of garlic and basil, bringing a bottle of wine they had been saving for a special occasion. Seemed appropriate to open it today, he explained. 6 months since everything ended, a sort of survival anniversary. They toasted with glasses of Chianti, the dark red liquid capturing the candlelight that Meredith had lit. It wasn't romantic in the traditional sense, but there was intimacy in the scene, a deep connection forged through shared trauma and mutual healing. To new beginnings, Brandon said. To truth, Meredith added. To Margaret, they said together. Dinner was punctuated by laughter, something that had been too rare in that house. Raymond joined them with Tommy, turning a quiet meal into an impromptu family gathering. The boy chattered about school, soccer, and the video games he wanted for his birthday. His innocence, a reminder that the world kept turning, that life continued even after horror tried to stop it. After Raymond and Tommy left, Meredith helped Brandon clean up, their movements synchronized in a way that only comes from time spent together. They washed dishes side by side, no conversation necessary. Comfort, only in shared presence. Do you really think Margaret would approve of all this? Brandon eventually asked, his voice quiet. That there could be something good come out of something so terrible? Meredith considered carefully before responding. I think Margaret would understand that tragedy doesn't exclude growth. That we can honor the dead by living with purpose, turning pain into something that helps others. She dried the last pot, placing it back on the shelf with care. And I think she would be proud of who you've become through all this. Who we've become, Brandon corrected. You've changed too, Meredith. You're no longer invisible, no longer just serving in the background. You've become a heroine, a teacher, a friend. The words hung between them, carrying the weight of recognition that Meredith had longed for 15 years. She no longer needed external validation to know her own worth, but hearing it acknowledged still warmed something deep within her core. They moved to the living room, where a fire crackled in the fireplace that Raymond had lit earlier. Meredith sank into the comfortable chair that had once belonged to Margaret, a piece Brandon had insisted she use. He sat across from her, and for a long moment they simply existed in the space, processing the journey that had brought them to this point. You know what's funny? Meredith eventually said. That $2 piggy bank was the best thing that could have happened to me. It awakened something in me that had been dormant, a refusal to remain invisible and undervalued. Without that humiliation, I might never have paid enough attention to notice what Victoria really was. So I should thank you for my own insensitivity? Brandon asked with dry humor. Maybe we should thank how pain can awaken us when nothing else can. She looked at the dancing flames, hypnotized by their eternal movement. Margaret was taken by greed, but in trying to use that loss to create another victim, Victoria inadvertently created something she never expected. What? An alliance. Two people who learned that strength doesn't come from wealth or power, but from integrity and the determination to protect those who matter most. Brandon nodded slowly, absorbing that truth. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and somewhere distant an owl hooted, its call echoing through the property that now served as a testament, not to tragedy, but to resilience. As the night deepened, Meredith knew that the morning would bring new choices, new challenges, and a new chapter in a life she was just beginning to live fully. She would teach at Yale, help launch the residency program, visit her sister more frequently now that she had resources and time. And she would continue to be Brandon's friend, a constant presence as he navigated his own path through grief and eventual renewal. The revenge she had planned so carefully, wrapped in patience and meticulous precision, had delivered more than justice. It had delivered liberation, not just from Victoria and Marcus, but from the chains of invisibility and undervaluation that Meredith had carried for so long. She was no longer the employee who accepted crumbs. She was a woman who knew her own worth, who had faced predators and emerged victorious, who had transformed humiliation into strength. The $2 piggy bank would remain on her dresser, a permanent reminder of where she had started. But the true gift of that devastating Christmas was not in the cheap porcelain or the coins that jingled inside. It was in the awakening it had provoked, in the journey it had initiated, in the woman it had forced her to become. And as the fire died down to glowing embers and Brandon gently fell asleep in the chair across from her, Meredith Hayes smiled into the darkness, knowing that finally, after 15 years of living in the shadows, she had found her own light.